Hello, I am Jake Collins, and this is Knightmare Series 8, Episode 10, which was first broadcast on the 11th of November 1994. I don't like to date these commentaries too much by mentioning exactly when I'm recording them, but I think it is worth noting that I'm releasing this commentary on the 30th anniversary of the episode's original air date on CITV. It's also worth noting that I started my first series of Knightmare commentaries with Series 1, Episode 1, the first episode, and now I'm finishing my third and final series of Knightmare commentaries with the final episode. And I've set myself the task of doing it without mentioning the C word, or indeed the S word that goes along with it, because I've made my feelings on that particular subject abundantly clear on other commentaries, particularly for the episode before this one. So I'm going to try to express myself in different ways without using the S word or the C word. I remember first watching this back on the 11th of November 1994. I've been wondering, well, they've got an entire episode left for Dunstan to win, and he's in the penultimate chamber, despite all this nonsense about there having been no time for a level 2. Here he is. It's surely not going to take him long to win now. Just got to do this chamber and a final chamber, and that really is what happens. How on earth are they going to fill in all the time, I thought. Then watching that scene with the reach wand and the little key symbol, I thought, oh, this is how they're going to fill in the entire episode. Have Dunstan stand there for 15 minutes trying to get this key into the lock. It doesn't take quite that long in the end, but it does take a long time. The room there is only half as dangerous as when Nathan was snuffed out there unfairly. It only had the fireballs raining from the ceiling there for Dunstan. With Nathan, they were shooting out towards him as well, and he had to pick up a piece of food. No challenge at all there for Dunstan's team compared to what Nathan's team were faced with. This quest chamber, final chamber where the quest object sits, is quite good. As I've mentioned, I like Linghorn and Marblehead as locations, and this as a final quest chamber location in Marblehead feels pretty appropriate. The pit, the little window there with the quest object sitting in it, door for Lord Fear to come in and threaten you. I quite like that. I would have liked to see it under different circumstances, where Nathan completed the challenges in the previous room, legion that they were, unlike the Dunstan's team, and then came through to this room where the cup was sitting in the window alcove next to him. There's a very old theory / joke that they didn't have a cup prop, so they had to go to great lengths to stop anyone who was questing for the cup actually get that far. In series 4 to 8, when there are actually physical quest objects, and well, Nathan really got the closest, didn't he? The non-existent cup prop was right on the other side of the door he didn't quite manage to reach because Tim Child hated him. It's not a bad final encounter with Lord Fear either, actually. The Paladin spell, particularly powerful magic. They just picked it up off the clue table, didn't they? It's better when they've had to work at getting particularly powerful magic, or even a silly little spell in the case of Ben in Series 6, to defeat Lord Fear, but they've had to go through some sort of process to get a special weapon to defeat Lord Fear. Just picking up the Paladin potion off the table and almost drinking it a few times and being urged not to as they go through level 3. is not as satisfying. But nevertheless, it's not a bad one of Lord Fear's in-person appearances when it comes right down to it. This room is horrible. Horrible colours. It looks like a test. An unfinished Marblehead room that Hordress and Dunstan go through very quickly and then get onto this moving through the sewer pipe on the moving platform, which, as David Bradshaw and Stephen Wilson told us in the Ice Shield fanzine, was a fantastic room. Well, I don't like it that much, but I suppose it's quite visually stimulating if you like that sort of thing, moving through the sewer pipe in that way. But it never should have happened. And yes, I certainly do agree with them about that. And it's one of those occasions where people who aren't really actors have been told to act, as it were. All this, come on, you're almost there from the advisors. That's obviously not from them. They've been directed to do it. I don't know if Tim Child told them to, or if director Martin Cairns, who only directed Series 8 and none of the rest of Knightmare, told them to. But whoever told them to was wrong to do so, because it sounds absolutely rubbish. Their forced encouragement of Horrors and Dunstan coming back through the sewer pipe. One of the great things about Knightmare, and of course there are so many great things, is that it's a genuine adventure for the real-life young people from our world who come to play it. We see their genuine reactions, interactions, thought processes, emotions. So if you start to force them like that, oh, come on, encourage them through the tunnel, it just comes across as very false. And, well, that's always rankled with me as one component part of a whole huge situation that always has rankled with me, as everyone knows. But here, of course, we're beginning the final ever quest with Oliver and his team from various places in Leicestershire, or at least from Leicester and Melton Mowbray. And goodness me, if there's time for them to muck about in level 1 and have a couple of rooms of level 3, there was certainly time for Dunstan to do a quick, or even not particularly quick, level 2 after all wasn't there. And let's not go on about that any more than I have done already, because it's all been said, and it's all very true. Watching this Traegard and Majida starting off the quest sequence reminds me of something I didn't quite get round to saying when talking about Majida before, and Majida's interactions with Traegard and what I don't like about them. And this one isn't a problem with Majida specifically as a character. It's a problem with the expanded assistant role they give her. I do think Traegard's assistant should never have climbed up onto equal terms with him. He is the dungeon master. He should be the one leading the way and presenting the show, talking to the dungeoneer, equipping the dungeoneer. But really, in Series 8, Traegard and his assistant really do come across more as co-hosts than dungeon master and assistant. I don't think Majida should be joining in with explaining the quest equipment. That's not the assistant's job. That is the prerequisite of a dungeon master, as Traegard points out in Series 7. So that's why I say I think Majida takes away from Traegard's role in some ways, but unlike the bickering, unsatisfactory interplay between them that you get that I don't like, that's not actually because of Majida the character. It is because of expanding the assistant role while Majida happens to be in it. It all adds to the lack of kind of special status as dungeon master and aura of power that Traegard always had before in this series. He's become more of a co-host with Vegeta. He doesn't have his own special chair to sit in. He's not really being valued as the mainstay, integral core of Knightmare that he really is and always has been. And that's something that's always annoyed me about Series 8 as well, of course, as I've mentioned before. And it really does come to a head in this episode, where Treyguard's traditional end of series speech is absent for the first and only time in Knightmare's run. As I said before, I really think a big reason for my being so desperate for Knightmare Series 9 to turn up, even if it did turn out to be a final series of 10 episodes, is that I didn't want this specific episode of Knightmare to be the last one. Imagine if that 10 episode Series 9 had happened, and at the end of it Treyguard had done a wonderful overall farewell speech to us, and even perhaps called us for one final time, the Watchers of Illusion, to bid us a final farewell. If he'd done that, everyone would have been so happy. I'm always reminded here in Oliver's first clue room of Richard and Rebecca, Angela, Rowena, and the Green Blade. This is even worse, really. The book is for browsing, the stick is for dowsing. You can't much more plainly say take the book and the stick. But we're still mucking about with the key. The stick and the key. Think of the scroll, for goodness sake. Vegeta can't believe this is happening again. And I'm sure all of us can't believe the suggestion, change the stick for the book. Change the stick for the book. I never compiled a list of stupidest advisor remarks or instructions for the iShield fanzine, but if I did, I think that one really would have to top it. Quite an amusing description from advisor Anthony there of Sidrus, a fairy in the middle of the room, and she's making a jester fly around in the air. Well, it's not actually a fairy, it's Sidrus, but she does have her magic wand out. Quite appropriate, really, to see final appearances in this episode from Lord Fear, Lizard, Hordris, Motley, Sidrus, and Smirkanorth. All have been heavily featured in Knightmare over the years, even if it's only over a couple of series in the case of Lizard, and in at least 3 series, and as many as 6 in the case of the rest of those characters. But they're none of them used particularly well here. Motley's final appearance I find very underwhelming. He doesn't even speak to the Dungeoneer, really. It's very quick, just being flown around by Sidrus there, and then when she brings him down, after Oliver returns her spellbook, he just has a bit of a back and forth with Sidrus. Hardly anything at all. That's the last time I let you practice on me. Ooh, I'm off. And that's the last of Motley and the last of Paul Valentine. A fleeting appearance. But still, at least it's an appearance of some sort. There's a scenario going on in this level about slowing down the blades in the corridor of blades because Lord Fear's just sped them up. Giving Sidrus' spellbook back causes her to give the team a creep spell to charm Smirkanorth so that he'll give them something to slow down the blades. It's not intrinsically bad as a scenario, that. And the creep spell to charm a dragon, quite a nice idea, really. Of course, Smirkanorth has never really needed charming before. It never sat quite right with me tricking Smirkanorth into helping you in that way. Better to give him something that he wants for his help, like Rebecca did earlier in this series with the Firestone. Really, a creep spell should be used on an unfriendly dragon, like Baal Shabar, or is it Firestorm of Marblehead now? So, an interesting idea, not very well used, and, well, that sums up most of Series 8 quite well, really. So perhaps an appropriate thing to include here in the final episode. Goodness me, they get into a tiz here, don't they? Sidris very clearly says cast the spell before waking Smirkanov. Oliver appears to have understood that. The advisors obviously haven't bothered listening to Sidris at all. She says to cast the spell first, Oliver insists. Well, you're absolutely right, Oliver, so the advisors eventually agree to do that. But then what does Oliver say? Cast, after he's called Smirkanov. Here's the last ever piece of spellcasting with that horrible book, Creep. What has triggered him to call Smirkanov if he hasn't noticed the advisor casting the spell? Very, very strange situation. They're very hard to get to grips with. Like the episode as a whole, really. Hard to get to grips with, hard to stomach. It was 30 years ago, it is now. And that will hold true forevermore. So whether it's 30 years since this episode was on while you're listening to this, or if it's a great many more years than that, that's still going to hold true. This episode is hard to stomach. Indeed, when I was having a flick through it, just looking at various bits, seeing how quickly, being reminded how quickly Dunstan actually wins, we're getting on to starting the next quest after about 5 minutes. And it was striking me how, well, come on, there was some time you could have used on level 2. But looking through the various bits, just thinking about what I was going to say, looking at the images of this episode, it hurt. It actually physically hurt my heart. And it always has. Every time I see this episode, it does hurt. So I should stop looking at it, really, shouldn't I? And perhaps after I finish doing this commentary, I will stop looking at it. Yes, there's a Maya Trog in level 1 here, isn't there? We've already heard it. Sidris has helped Oliver hurry out of the room because there's a Maya Trog coming. But here we actually see it on level 1. It's because they've only just thought of it in the previous episode and they want to get it in as much as possible. As I mentioned before, I'd much rather have seen trolls. Ah, the blades are slowed down, are they? But we haven't seen them cast the burst spell. That makes a horrendous lack of sense on screen. They should have had an opportunity to do spellcasting B-U-R-S-T, because that's what Smirkanov gave them, to slow the blades back down. But there we are. It's quite appropriate in some ways to see the Corridor of Blades, such a long-standing puzzle stretching all the way back to Series 4, make its appearance here in Knightmare's final episode. And as I've also mentioned before, that's a very good attempt at it from Advisor Anthony. Quick, accurate, one-word instructions which Oliver follows promptly and correctly. That's got to be a contender for the best handling of the Corridor of Blades ever. Certainly a lot better than Dunstan's. You know, I think power to rule pills is one of the flimsiest concepts for a clue object ever on Knightmare. Again, I never made the list of flimsiest concepts for clue objects to put in the Eye Shield fanzine, but if I had, those power to rule pills would be right at the top of it, I think. What's the scenario here? Bung those to Maldame, so she'll help them. Ooh, power to rule pill. She swallows one and suddenly has the power to rule the entire my world again. What a load of crap that is. And we've got a complicated, devious plan from Lizard here with the second but false shield, blocking the sewer pipe that Dunstan used to escape with a Maya trog. You're really wasting your time here, Lizard, setting all this up, because there's absolutely no time to do anything at all after this clue room. So really, the kidsy's making one more attempt to enter Marblehead. It's quite a futile attempt, and really, like a lot of teams that really don't have time to win in final episodes of Series of Knightmare, it's not very interesting or entertaining either. It is an incredibly inglorious end for Knightmare. Just over a week before I first watched this episode of Knightmare, I had watched a lot of the old furniture from my granny's holiday cottage, which was being sold, being loaded into a yellow van that was owned by Horsham District Council to be carted off and disposed of. And that emotional experience to me was very like watching this final episode of Knightmare. In both cases, I was looking at something that had always been an integral part of my life, and that I associated with happy, warm, fuzzy memories, really as the building blocks of my entire existence, being transformed in front of my very eyes from something glorious and transcendent to a useless pile of old rubbish that really had no further place in the world. And in both cases, that was very hard to come to terms with, and really, in many ways, it still is. However, as I've said before, we mustn't dwell too much on the inglorious end when we think of what these things mean to us. And just as I still have in my bedroom 4 surviving pieces of furniture from my granny's holiday cottage, including one that was originally given as a golden wedding present to her parents in 1956. So I must look back on the glorious parts of Knightmare that still bolster my spirit to this very day, and be grateful for those. And I am grateful for those, and as I said before, I'll always love those, even though, in the case of this particular episode, the final episode of Knightmare, gratitude and love are 2 of the very last things I feel about it. And there we are, an end to Knightmare itself, and an end to my 3rd and final series of Knightmare commentaries. Thanks for joining me. Goodbye.